Well, hello from San Clemente. We are turning the corner on the CRF450 project. Pretty excited. We are getting back into the reassembly process here. Just a few things that I wanted to go over as we're all the way down into the depth of the engine. We've split the cases, we've pulled everything out, we've assessed all the parts, cleaned all the parts, and you'll see all of that in the upcoming video. The main things that I wanted to point out is I've replaced these crank bearings both on the right and the left, and we'll be replacing those. And you'll see in the video where I heated up the aluminum in the cases to expand the aluminum and then tap those old bearings out of there. Now, getting ready for the reassembly, I checked the basically how well these bearings spin and move, and if there's any play in the races. Get all of that dirt out of there, get it clean and shiny. You'll also see in the video where I take and clean the mating surfaces off. So scrape all of the mating surfaces with this razor blade. That's probably the most effective tool. Make sure, and there's a few places here where the case was a little scuffed. So in those cases, I sand it down with this planing pad and go all the way across and just sort of mill the surface level with this sanding pad to get all of those surfaces clean. After all of that, you'll see where I pressure washed with water the entire engine cases after I had tapped out the old bearings. You don't want to do that with the new bearings in there, but pressure washed all that out of there to get it clean. Then I check for dirt in these bearings if I feel anything. So in reassembling all of this, the first thing that we're going to do is put and what you'll see in this video, you'll see me reinstalling the crank bearings by applying heat to this aluminum surface, getting it hot. That expands the aluminum, and then I've left the new crank bearings in the freezer overnight, and they are in this ice pack here. They are frozen, and what that does is shrink the bearings so that they should fall into place. They may require a little tapping of the hammer. I've got some oversight. So the bearings are frozen. You'll see me heat up the engine cases to put those back in, and then I will be reinstalling new seals in place as well. And then you'll see me reinstall a new crank. Now this is a Wiseco crank that I purchased online. I got this whole kit with gaskets, seals, and the whole bit for about $460 bucks. So it doesn't take you long before you start racking up a bunch of money in these engine builds. And but this is probably the most worth it, worth the most money, to just go ahead, replace the crank, and get these older engines to where they're running. They're going to run a long time. So if you go with an OEM crank, you're probably guaranteed 100 hours before you have to replace it. One of these cranks, you're probably looking at anywhere from 50 to 100 hours. Keep an eye on it. I would say prior to 50 hours or at 50 hours at least, at the very least, you're going to want to pull the top end off and have a look at it anyway, do an assessment on and see where the rod is at. If you let these things go too long, beyond, as I mentioned before, beyond the point of no return, it's really difficult to regain lost ground. All right, well, here I am pressure washing the engine, and I can't emphasize enough that once you're finished with this, you really need to blow everything out with air and then immediately put WD-40 or some sort of oil solvent into the bearings so that they don't rust. Okay, well, here I am using an impact screwdriver to take out the screws that hold the little bracket pieces that hold those bearings in place, help hold them in place. and a lot of times these are Loctited in place. When I reassemble this, I will use blue Loctite, which isn't the red permanent Loctite, but it holds it well enough under high heat to hold those things in place. So here I am taking those screws out, and then you'll see me heating up the cases. I'm just using a small propane torch here, but before I do that, I want to pull those seals out. So you want to pull the seals out before you apply the heat. It's kind of where I had to stop what I was doing and go ahead and pull that seal out. I'm not going to reuse those, but I want to pull them out anyway, so that when I apply heat to that casing, it doesn't melt the seal in place. Okay, so here I am. I'm going to start actually applying heat to the cases here, and I've found a socket that is the right size to go ahead and tap that bearing out. So here I am just applying heat, and I apply enough heat so that when you grab the end of the casing in the front there, you shouldn't be able to hold it. So just apply heat. That expands the aluminum, and then I use 2 wood blocks that I set the engine casing on, and then just tap it out from there. All right, so here I am just cleaning out the inside of the case with a rag, and I'm getting ready to start just using a simple straight edge that you can buy, like a utility knife straight edge, to take that old gasket material off. And once I start scraping all of that stuff off, then I'll mill it and plane it with a sanding block. Again, you don't want to take too much off of there. You just want enough to clean the surface. And I use the block that's fairly long. You know, it's 8 inches long or so that it can span across the entire surface. You want everything to be level as you're cleaning it off, but you don't want to remove very much aluminum, because if you don't keep it level, obviously it's going to leak, potentially leak and cause other issues too. So you don't want to take off too much aluminum, just enough to clean it. And then there will be some debris that, as you're cleaning the surfaces, the mating surfaces, there will be some debris that possibly, if you're going to reuse those old bearings in the transmission, you're going to want to, that's where I showed the pressure washing earlier. You're going to want to pressure wash those and then immediately blow them out with air and put some WD-40 in them to keep them from rusting. So this is kind of the cleaning process that I'm doing here. Now here in this next step, I actually put a cleaning pad onto a Makita grinder, and it works really well. It's just like a Scotch-Brite pad. You buy them at Lowe's, pretty cheap, 3.5-inch pad. And I like to use that to clean the outside of the engine cases, get them all shiny. And then from there, I use a smaller Dremel wire brush and get in all the nooks and crannies and clean those cases really well before I put them back together. Now, I have applied gray ceramic paint sometimes to the cases if I can't get them clean enough. But these were I was able to get them pretty shiny. So I'm just cleaning everything off. And then want to also emphasize too that this was all before I did the pressure washing. So this cleaning and all of this step is prior to pressure washing. So you're going to want to do all this cleaning and then pressure wash afterwards, especially if you're going to reuse those bearings. And again, once you pressure wash and clean everything, here I am going over the mating surfaces again with a knife, just kind of doing some final cleaning on the other case, and then I will get the pad out and put a little sandpaper on there and just clean those surfaces. Okay, so now I am heating up the engine cases for the reinstallment of the bearings. So prior to this step, I pressure washed everything, cleaned all of the bearing surfaces with, you can use all kinds of different cleaning agents. I like starting fluid or ether. Works pretty well to clean out those bearing races. You just want to make sure you get everything out of there after the pressure washing, and then make sure and put some WD-40 or some sort of lubricant in there to ensure that they don't rust. But here I am heating up the cases for the reinstallment of the new bearings. So I have the bearings. I had put them in ice, but I'm having to tap on them a little bit to get them in there now. There is a kit that you can buy at Rocky Mountain ATVMC. This is probably not the best way to do this, and you really need to use a bearing driver kit that you can purchase. Anyway, I got them in there. Now here you're seeing me take a little sandpaper and run it around the edges of where that crank bearing seats into. And the reason I was doing that was somebody had used something to tap the old one out prior to when I tapped them out, and there was some really rough dings that somebody had taken out of the engine cases. So I was just trying to smooth those out with a little sandpaper, but you want to be very careful again in where those in messing with that aluminum, where those crank bearings seat in there. You want everything to seal well and be tight, and you don't want to take too much off. But there was some really bad burrs there that I took out with some sandpaper. So here I am putting the other crank bearing in. I heated up the case, and here I am torquing those bolts. I believe I torqued them to 8 foot-pounds. Those screws, I just torqued them with a torque wrench, and I put a little Loctite on those. Here I am installing the crank, the new crank. So put a little oil in those bearings, and those cranks on these 4-stroke engines pop right into place. If you're familiar with a 2-stroke engine, sometimes they can be pretty tight fitting into the crank bearing. Here I am just kind of running the transmission gears through, checking to make sure that everything was set into place when I put the transmission into the right engine case. And now I'm just putting a little oil around the mating surfaces there. Now, some people put gasket sealer. I'm just putting a little oil on there so that the gasket sticks to the surface of the mating surface there where the two cases join. And I just use a little oil there just so that it sticks and that gasket doesn't move around on me. But I don't like to use RVT gasket sealer. Some people do. But I'm just kind of coating some of the parts there with oil, and then I will begin to reinstall the gasket here. So we're getting closer to closing up the cases at this point, and just fitting that gasket, the new gasket, around the dowel pins. So make sure and put your dowel pins back in place if you remove them. And just fit that gasket around there. Now at this point, some people use a very thin strip or a very thin amount of gasket sealer. You can do that, RVT, high temperature gasket sealer. I don't. as some people do. Now here I am installing the shift drum levers. So there is on the right side, there are two levers labeled 4R and 4L. The 4L lever goes in there first. Excuse me, the 4R lever goes in first, then the 4L lever. And you just want to install those and then put the pin through them both and put the pin off to the side. Okay, then there's a 4C, and the 4C points to the bottom. So you see I flipped it over, and then that goes into the right side, or excuse me, the left side as you're looking at it there. The left side of the shift drum and transmission. So what those levers do are they go into the transmission between the gears, and they actually link the shift drum to the transmission. So it's pretty important that those get placed in the right place. And here's the shift drum. And so you just set those things in place. The letters on the right two R and L levers, the writing goes in the upside direction, and on the C on the left-hand side, that writing goes down. You point it down. Here I am checking the bearings just to make sure everything's clear. I went ahead and put the oil valve, reed valve, in that left side engine case that I'm going to put on top. And now I'm getting ready to put the oil pump in place. Here's the oil pump. So you're going to want to set that on top of that casing where it runs on the right side casing. There is a place where that oil pump runs, and you'll see it in the casing. And just set it there, and then when you go, here I am putting the actual strainer, oil pump strainer, into, I will install that into the case later on, okay? But I was just showing that that was the oil pump that will hook up to the strainer later on. So basically you want all those holes to line up, the oil pump, the crank, and then the transmission, and you get all three of those to line up, and you just slide that left side engine case over everything, and you may have to kind of wiggle it around a little bit to get it to fall into place. Now, some people use a hammer at this point. I do not like to use a hammer. I try to do everything by hand because I don't want to force anything. And these things are really like a clock. It's amazing how these Japanese engines fit so tightly, and they're perfectly manufactured. And if there is one little washer out of place, you'll know it. One little washer on the transmission, you'll know it because the cases will not go back together properly. So here I am. It's not going together, so I just take the case off, double check everything. I think I did this 2 or 3 times just to make sure that everything was in line and straight going back into place. Now that oil pump had kind of fallen off when I pulled it off of that time. So now I'm gonna give it another try, but I wasn't comfortable with how that that left side engine case was going on there. So now I'm gonna put it on again, line up the crank bearing or the crank shaft with the transmission toward the back, toward my right hand toward the back, with the oil pump toward my left hand in the front. Kind of wiggle it around a little bit. And between those 3 points, it should fit really tight, and you can just kind of wiggle it into place. Now once I get this left side case on and get it pulled tight, again, I'm trying to do it, most of it by hand. And I left all this footage of me messing with it because this is a reality of how these things go. Sometimes it takes a while, especially if you haven't done these things before, it takes a while to make sure you get everything sealing up properly. So at this point, we've reinstalled the transmission, we've reinstalled the shift drum brackets, we've reinstalled the shift drum, we've installed the crank, and we've installed the oil pump. So those are the main things that you want to have in place as you go to reseal this engine up. And I left all this footage in here because it just shows what it takes to make sure everything lines up. And again, I don't like to use a hammer. Sometimes you'll see people pull out a rubber mallet or a hammer at some point here and start hammering the two together, but I don't like to do that. And if it doesn't fall into place by hand, here I am, I'm going to take it off again, I think, and just make sure that it's going on straight. Now it's going on a little bit better. And at one point I grabbed the left front bolt that holds the head bolt, that left front shaft, and I was able to get some leverage there and start to wiggle it into place right there. And from there I was able to get it to move by hand down into place. Now there are crankshaft presses that you can use at this point too to bring the engine case. It grabs onto the crankshaft and closes the engine case back into place. But I with these 4-stroke engines, I like to I like to do it by hand, wiggle it into place until it gets close. And then once it gets within, a quarter inch or less of a gap, and everything is straight and lining up, then you can put the bolts inside of the casing around the crankshaft, and even back on the back side of the casing around the transmission, where the transmission comes out and the sprocket connects on. You can put those bolts in and gently start to pull the cases back together, but be careful that nothing is binding at this point. So I got it as far as I could by hand, and now I think I'm going to put some bolts into place and start pulling the cases back together. So there I was, just blowing everything out with air, and now I'm getting ready to install the bolts, and obviously make sure you have the right length bolts, because all of these bolts are different sizes and different lengths. They aren't different diameters, but different lengths. And some bolts with a arrow require a brass washer. So make sure that you put that brass washer on those bolts with an arrow on the casing. So I'm putting all the bolts in and assembling all of that and tightening up the engine. So here I'm getting ready to show where those brass washers go, which bolts, and there's an arrow on those bolts that I'm pointing to. Those all need a brass washer on them. There's an arrow on the casing indicating where those brass washers go. Make sure you do that. And there I am showing the small gap that's there, and I will go ahead and pull all that into place by tightening all that down carefully. All right, so here I'm going to show how everything is pulled tightly into place and tightened up and snug. No gaps left. And we are getting closer to getting these cases finished up here. The remaining things that need to be done are to put the sprocket on the end of the oil pump shaft, which I'm doing here. And there's a small circlip that is attached using a snap ring pliers that as you pull the pliers together, it opens up the snap ring and then you push it into place. So there I am putting the gear on the end of the oil pump, and then I'll put the snap ring on there. Before that, I actually inserted the strainer that I had showed earlier in the video. That strainer is already in there and the bolts are in place. And all of that has been assembled. There's a small snap ring. I'm going over to grab the pliers. And as you squeeze those pliers, it opens that snap ring up and you slide it over the shaft. So there's two little holes that you put the pliers into. And as you squeeze the pliers, and obviously you want to put your eye protection on to do this so that nothing flies in your eyes. Squeeze the pliers and put it over the shaft and pop it into place. So now, as you can see, I'm about ready to show you a bird's eye view of everything being done. So there's the gear that I just put on the oil pump, and the strainer is in place, and then I've also put the cam chain tensioner arm there, that black arm, in place with that small bolt right below the crankshaft. So we just have to, from here, install our counterbalancing shaft on that left-hand side. Here I'm showing how everything is sealed up and tight all the way around. I've got those bolts tightened down. Okay, well, everything was assembled on the bottom end, and I have another video showing the reassembly of the top end, including replacing the piston and rings, as well as another separate video where I'm going to show the reassembly of the head, where I put titanium valves in the head, and then I'm going to show you the importance of the timing and all of that. So as you put all of the primary drive gears on and the counterbalancing shaft on and all of that, it's very imperative that you get the timing right on these four-stroke engines, because if you don't and you go to start it, that's very common with people who rebuild engines and don't understand timing aspect. You can basically have things out of time and run the valves right into the piston. So I will be leading you through that process in a separate video, just talking about timing alone, but stay tuned as we get closer to finishing this project. I already have the build completed and the engine installed, and so stay tuned.